Welcome to today's Heart of a Shepherd as we continue our chronological study of the Scriptures. We are in today the book of 2 Kings, chapter 24 and 25. In fact, with today's Bible study, we will conclude our study of this wonderful historical book known as 2 Kings. Well, the title of our devotional today is Warning. God gives a nation the leaders it deserves. Let's consider the scriptures today for our study. Well, one of the things I'll point out to you is that paralleled in tomorrow's devotional study, which is from 2 Chronicles 36, we'll consider the same unfolding of events that we find in our study today. And as a reminder, 2 Kings was penned as a contemporary history of Israel and Judah, while 2 Chronicles is believed to have been written after the Babylonian captivity. Well, our study picks up the narrative of events that were the background of God's judgment against Jerusalem. Now, the king is Jehoiakim. He is the third to the last king of Judah. And you might remember that he had cut up and burned Jeremiah's scroll, which warned that the destruction of Jerusalem was imminent. Now, that took place in Jeremiah 36, where that was recorded. Now, though he was warned that his evil deeds would bring God's judgment upon the nation, we might remember that King Jehoiakim continued in his sins and, quote, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. 2 Kings 23 and verse 37. Well, that brings us to 2 Kings 24. Now, recorded in verses 1 through 7 of 2 Kings 24, we have King Jehoiakim's reign and his final days. Now, Jehoiakim's appeal to Pharaoh for help against Babylon failed in 2 Kings 23 and verse 35. Young and as foolish as he was evil, Jehoiakim set his heart against the king of Babylon. We read in 2 Kings 24 and verse 1, and he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Well, provoked by Jehoiakim's impetuous rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar sent mercenary raiders against Judah to destroy the nation, as the Lord spake by his servants, the prophets. That's chapter 24 and verse 2. Well, the prophet Daniel recorded the same events in his book, which we'll study later. And there we read, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. Daniel 1 and verse 1. Well, the Lord had not forgotten the sins of Manasseh and his lineage, and how Judah had shed innocent blood, even sacrificing their sons and their daughters. We read that in chapter 24, verse 3 and 4. Now, understand that the slaughter of the innocent ones and the fact that the Lord would not pardon that sin, well, it should give us, in the 21st century, pause to consider the millions of children, babies, that have been aborted by their mothers. If God would reach out and remember the sins of Judah against her as a nation, surely we too will suffer God's judgment. Then notice King Jehoiachin's brief reign and disgrace. Now that's recorded 2 Kings 24 verse 5 through 16. Now, with King Jehoiakim dead, chapter 24 verse 5, his son Jehoiachin succeeded him. Well, like his father, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to verse 9. And we read in verse 10, then Nebuchadnezzar came up against Jerusalem, and the king of Judah surrendered and was taken to Babylon after reigning for 3 months. Now, verses 8 through 12, that's where that's recorded. Well, fulfilling all the Lord had foretold through his prophets, we read that Nebuchadnezzar carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's house, and he cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord. verse 13. Now Nebuchadnezzar then determined to remove any threat of another uprising. And so we read that he carried away all Jerusalem and all the princes and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, we read in verse 14, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. Well, numbered among the captives was the royal household, verse 15. The prophet Ezekiel, that's recorded in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 1, and Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which is recorded in Daniel 1 and verse 6. And then consider with me King Zedekiah, the final king of Judah, in verses 17 through 20 of 2 Kings 24. Now Nebuchadnezzar appointed Mattaniah, I believe it's said, to succeed Jehoiakim as king. Now he was the king's uncle, the one that had been deposed, and he changed his name to, verse 17, Zedekiah. Well, he was a mere 21 years old when he became king, and we read in verse 18 that he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. Now Zedekiah was left to rule an impoverished nation that lacked leaders skilled in governing and war. He was the end of a long line of foolish, wicked kings. Now, like the kings before him, again we read in verse 19 that he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he rebelled against the king of Babylon. Well, as we will see in 2 Kings 25, to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar was the height of folly. Reflected on Judah's history, I'm convinced that the Lord gives a nation the leaders it deserves. And surely that is as true today as it was in Judah's day. Well, let's conclude our study today by looking at 2 Kings 25. Now, the book of 2 Kings began with Elijah prophesying and calling Israel to repent or face God's judgment in 2 Kings chapter 1. And so our study of this historical book concludes with the prophet Jeremiah mourning the destruction of the temple and the people being led away to Babylon. Consider with me then, if you would, the final siege of Jerusalem. Now, verses 1 through 12. Now, the siege of Jerusalem lasted nearly 2 years until we read that there was no bread in the city. And we know from history and from the Bible that the people actually resorted to cannibalism during that time. Now, King Zedekiah, when he realized that all was lost, fled Jerusalem with his guards. However, he made it only as far as Jericho before he was captured by the soldiers of Babylon. He was then brought before Nebuchadnezzar to be judged. While found guilty of rebellion, Zedekiah witnessed the execution of his sons, after which he suffered having his eyes put out. Then Nebuchadnezzar commanded Zedekiah, blind and bound in chains, to be carried to Babylon. Now, the prophecies of God's judgment against Jerusalem, you see, were fulfilled when Nebuzaradan, the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's guard, we read in verse 9, burnt the house of the Lord, meaning the temple, and the king's house, that is his palaces, and all the houses of Jerusalem. We also read in verse 10 that he broke down the walls of the city. Well, according to verses 13 through 17, all the vessels of the temple were taken as spoils of war. The leaders of Judah who might have threatened an uprising were either slain or taken captives to Babylon in verse 11 and then verses 18 through 21. Left behind, as we've already noted, were the poorest people who served Babylon as vine dressers and husbandmen, that is, farmers of the land. Then consider with me the remnant left behind, beginning in verse 22 through 26. Now, in the aftermath of Jerusalem's overthrow and the exile of Judah's leaders, Nebuchadnezzar chose a man that we've already met in the book of Jeremiah, and his name was Gedaliah. Now, this man was chosen, being a Jew, to govern Judah as his proxy, that is, as the proxy or the servant of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we've already noted that in Jeremiah 40 and 41, that there was a man named Ishmael, a distant relative of King David, who actually led an uprising against Gedaliah, and he was slain. Well, fearing the wrath of the Chaldees, the people then fled Judah, and we read in verse 26 that they came to Egypt. Now, King Jehoiachin, though, in a wonderful insight into God's favor, we read about him once again in verses 27 through 30. Now, King Jehoiachin had been in prison in the dungeon of Babylon for quite some time, and yet he was restored to favor by Nebuchadnezzar's successor. Now, though all seemed lost and a glimmer of hope emerged, though, in the final verses of 2 Kings 25, where Jehoiachin, like I've already said, the exiled and imprisoned king of Judah, found favor with evil Merodach, king of Babylon. Now, he was Nebuchadnezzar's successor. Well, the king of Babylon then elevated Jehoiachin, the former king of Judah, we read in verse 28, above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon. And so the king of Babylon gave Jehoiachin a change of clothes, fed him, provided him an allowance, and we read, verse 29 through 30, a daily rate for every day, all the days of his life. Well, a closing thought for today. In the darkest hour of Israel and Judah's history, a king of David's lineage, Jehoiachin, found favor with the heathen king of Babylon. But we need to ask the question, why? Why did suddenly a king of Judah who had been in prison for years, why did he all of a sudden find favor? And I'm going to suggest it was perhaps because of the influence of men like the prophet Daniel and others who brought copies of the scriptures with them. Indeed, the wise men of Babylon took a great interest in Israel and Judah's history and in the prophecies of the scriptures. In fact, I believe the wise men from the east who are recorded in Matthew chapter 2, and they came to Jerusalem seeking he that is born King of the Jews, that is seeking Jesus Christ, I believe those men were influenced and educated by the dispersion of the Jews in this time. Well, the last memories of the Jewish captives were the flames consuming Jerusalem and the temple. And yet, as the Lord promised, God's people were restored to their homeland when 70 years of captivity were fulfilled. Well, I close with a thought. Take comfort, my friend. You see, God is sovereign, and we, his people, are never alone. Well, thank you for being a part of the Heart of the Shepherd and for enduring weeks and weeks of prophecies in the book of Jeremiah, and also as we return back to 2 Kings. What a blessing it is to end the story with a message of hope. I look forward to continuing tomorrow as we continue our chronological study of the Scriptures, and I appreciate you being a part of Heart of a Shepherd. God bless you, and bye-bye.